Welcome to another episode of Marketing Matters with Christie Welch. Today we're going to be looking at local foods in the post-pandemic world, so stay tuned. Welcome to another episode of Marketing Matters with Christie Welch. Today we're going to be looking at local foods in the post-pandemic world, and Christie, a direct food and agricultural marketing specialist with the Ohio State University Extension Program. Christie, it's always a pleasure talking with you.
Happy to be here again, Patrick.
I know that as it is the middle of 2021, we're just coming out of the pandemic, and it's interesting how a staple like food has been disrupted because of COVID-19.
It has been very interesting, Patrick, and it's interesting. I saw an article in the New York Times the other day that was talking about how shopping for food has changed. And so I thought it would be really interesting just to go down that list and talk about what our local food producers might be able to learn from this list of how food shopping has changed.
Well, you know, my wife and I, our food shopping has changed a great deal. Mm-hmm. To be frank, I have not stepped in any of the grocery stores in about a year and a half. Mm-hmm. And I sort of like the fact that store will bring your food out to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and we'll talk a little bit about that on the number 2 bullet you see there, Patrick. The online aisles are bustling, so we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But this was an article by Kim Servison, again, in the New York Times, and it's 7 ways the pandemic has changed how we shop for food. And again, I just thought it would be great information for our local food producers so they can understand what consumers are doing and looking for post-pandemic. And of course, at the beginning, what happened? Everybody started cooking more food at home, which had been really on the decline prior to that. And people were really looking for locally produced foods, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. So again, as we mentioned, more people are cooking at home. So if you haven't been in a grocery store, I would assume that you haven't been in a restaurant.
As a matter of fact, no, we have not. Now, we've sometimes ordered takeout, mm-hmm. but as far as eating and dining inside, no.
And that's true across most of the population here in the United States, especially, is that people made fewer trips to town. And so one of the big challenges, or one of the big changes that we saw, is that big jumps in staples, the pasta aisle, beer, those kinds of things. And one thing that was really interesting to me was that the demand for yeast increased 600%.
Really?
I have a brother that got in. I guess there was a big surge in people making their own bread at home, especially sourdough bread, and there were Instagram channels and everything dedicated to that. But that's one of the things that, of course, most of us didn't do a lot of prior to the pandemic.
Well, our eating patterns have changed. You know, one of the things that I found is that we tend to eat a lot of processed food also. Because, you know, again, when grocery stores come and deliver our food to our cars, it's much easier to order processed food.
That's true, Patrick, although I would say that produce is on the uptick as well, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But according to this list of Kim's, people were making fewer trips, but they were making better lists. So instead of waiting till the end of the day to decide what I'm going to have for dinner and run in the grocery store on my way home, people began to make lists where they could go to the store and get everything they needed for a week or two in one stop, whether that was curbside pickup or whether that was actually going into the store, people certainly made fewer trips into grocery stores to buy local foods.
That is interesting. My wife comes from a family that was used to going to the market and acquiring the daily or 2 days worth of food. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And the other big change as a result of the pandemic was the online sales, or what she calls here online aisles. And so when we think about markets, whether those are farm markets or farmers markets, pre-pandemic, some of them had adopted online sales platforms, but the pandemic really forced some of them to go that route. And if you look at these numbers, it's really interesting. Pre-pandemic, 81% of shoppers indicated they had never shopped online, and sales were $1.2 billion. Post-pandemic, $7.2 billion.
Wow.
And this barn-to-door sales were up more than 10 times, which barn-to-door is a software platform that is designed for farm markets and farmers markets to offer online sales to their customers. And actually, curbside pickup continues to grow, even at the point we are now. And so as a local food producer, customers are wanting that pre-order online curbside pickup. And so how can you take advantage of that demand by customers? If you don't currently have an online sales platform, is that something that makes sense for your particular operation?
One of the concerns that I had when we first started curbside pickup was that we would not get fresh fruit or fresh vegetables. It would be something that is basically leftover or somebody doesn't want. But we found that most of the produce, most of the fruit are fresh.
That's a really good point, Patrick. I used curbside pickup myself at my local grocery store, and some of the times the produce I got was great, and some of the times not so much. Now that we're in our growing season for Ohio, there is no reason for you not to be able to have quality local produce for your farm market and farmers markets. And so keep in mind especially if you have employees that are picking those items out for customers that are ordering online, make sure you're training those employees to know what customers would expect when buying produce from your local market.
That's a
very
good point.
The other thing that I thought was really interesting is orange is the new snack. Now, we don't grow oranges in Ohio. We do in the United States, but not here in Ohio. Typically we think of kind of the snack that's the go-to snack when it comes to fruit is a banana.
Right.
Lots of people buy bananas. One of the things I thought was interesting is it kind of switched to oranges. And it turns out that people perceive citrus to be immune boosting, so they're really looking for those items that can support your health. Oranges have a longer shelf life than some other of the fruit choices. So again, I know we don't grow oranges here in Ohio, but what products that do you grow that are immune boosting or part of what your customers perceive as really healthy for them to help them maintain their health? And so of course we think of things like kale and broccoli, apples. I mean, there's so many benefits to local fresh produce. Make sure that you're highlighting those health benefits to your customers as well.
I think that's very important when you do look at the kinds of produce that our farmers are producing in Ohio. You not only get the best value, but at a good price.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
And if it's shipped in from other places, et cetera, of course you're paying for that shipping.
Absolutely, Patrick. That's a very good point. And so, again, we're just getting into the peak of produce season here in Ohio. And so far, the weather has been really good for most of the folks in the state. It's a little wet in spots, a little dry in spots. But we really have to think about when our customers are wanting fresh, healthy foods, local foods. Again, make sure you as a producer are highlighting those things through signage, through your displays, through your online store if you have an online store, because that's really one of the things that's going to attract customers to purchase your products. And the other thing is that a lot of the grocery stores are redrawing the store. And so things like having the aisles be wider, making sure that their sanitation practices are published and followed, because again, customers want to feel that as a business, you're doing everything you can to help maintain their safety as well as your own. And while, yes, we're coming out of the pandemic, we're hearing daily on the news that there's a rise in this Delta variant. And so I think people are still very concerned about their health and safety. And so to continue to share with your customers what your safety practices are, and again, signage, again, on your website, communicate that with your customers as much as you can, and make sure that you have hand sanitizers and wipes. And if your market is small, which, you know, a lot of times our farm markets are small, maybe to maintain those one-way aisles for a while might really be beneficial to you and to your customers.
Christie, I do have a question in regards to the different chain grocery stores. Mm-hmm. Do they like to buy local-owned produce and fruits, vegetables?
That's a great question. And so we do have local food producers that sell to some of the more traditional grocery stores, some of the larger chains. I will say that it takes a lot of time to develop those relationships. And the other thing, it's a balancing act, because you know, maybe the grocery chain needs a semi-load of tomatoes today, and oh, my tomatoes aren't going to be ready for 2 days. Wow. You know, our customers still want it. They're not going to understand if they walk in the grocery store and there's no ripe tomatoes. Yeah. Because as customers, we've come to expect that that's available when we want it. And so there are producers here in Ohio that sell to grocery stores. It is something that you certainly have to develop those relationships and manage that, but it does happen to some extent. And I would say that the grocery stores that buy from local farms here in Ohio are usually very good to let you know that that is a local product and that it is an Ohio farm.
Oh, okay.
I was in one of the grocery stores several years ago down around the Cincinnati area, and they had big signage hanging above the produce that talked about the Ohio farm where that particular produce came from. And so that's the other thing I recommend for you as a producer. If you work with other markets or other farmers to bring in some of your produce, make sure that you're helping your customers understand which products you grow, which products a neighbor grows, or which products other farms here in Ohio produce. And just be transparent with your customers. I think that really, they appreciate that. The other interesting thing is that choices are shrinking. You know, one of the things that I used to talk about just in different trainings is the fact that we as customers like choice. Have you ever gone to the toothpaste aisle in the grocery store?
Aisles? Did you say aisles?
Exactly, Patrick. Who knew there were so many different types of toothpaste, and it can be really a little overwhelming. One of the things that resulted from the pandemic, for a couple of reasons, you know, if we had people shopping more online, they would go to those things that they really knew. There was less impulse buying, and so they really stuck with the brands with which they were familiar and trusted. The other part of that equation was that sometimes grocery stores, they were just items they couldn't get. And so the choices have shrunk in the aisles and food shopping. So customers, I think, are learning to appreciate that. Instead of standing there for 10 minutes to figure out which of the 1,000 type toothpastes are there you can buy, you know, if you have a couple, 3 or 4 choices, I think that's really helpful for customers. The other thing, again, due to all that the pandemic brought, Customers tend to be more price conscious. Now, again, it's important to think about some customers strictly shop on price. Some customers shop on value. And one of the things that we saw again with local food, especially early in the pandemic, is people were not as price sensitive. They just really wanted the food from somebody that they knew and trusted. And so they really were demanding that local food. And then the other thing to keep in mind too is that staples are still in demand. There was a rise in dried beans. Who'd have thought dried beans would have actually gone up in demand during the pandemic? But those are the kinds of things that we've been seeing.
You know, one of the grocery stores that I do shop, and when I do make lists, are very good about showing the different pictures of the products that I want. And by clicking on that picture, you can read the labels and you can better understand the product itself. So that's it makes it a little bit easier. However, now that you mentioned it, there are a number of different items that at one time were so readily available. Rarely are they available now.
Yeah, that's true, Patrick. And I think we all think immediately of hand sanitizers and wipes and those kinds of things that were almost impossible to find early on in the pandemic. And so I think it's important for you as a local food producer to really take that opportunity to understand what is it your customers want, how many choices do you need to offer them, and the other thing I encourage you to do is what items do you produce that are most profitable? And if you have a strong demand for those, maybe that's an opportunity for you to concentrate on those items, increase the profitability of your own farm, and still keep your customers happy and supplying what they need. The other thing, of course, is the freezer. One of the big things that I heard, especially from our local meat producers and farm markets and farmers markets that sold meat, they sold out early in the pandemic.
Oh, really?
And there was very little locally produced meat available after we were in a few months into the pandemic. Now, there's a lot of reasons that go into that. Of course, the pandemic highlighted some of the issues we have with our food supply chain. But again, it goes back to people really wanting those items that they trust. So knowing the farmer that produced those local proteins can go a long way in making sure people enjoy that product and trust that product. But the other thing that we think about when we think about fruits, especially, or vegetables, or frozen fruits and vegetables, again, because people were making fewer trips to purchase food, we had to really think about how we can incorporate those more shelf-stable products into our menu. So again, those frozen fruits and vegetables, they've come a long way. I think of these steamer bags of vegetables that you just throw them in the microwave and they're ready to go in 3 or 4 minutes. Now again, that's usually not available by local producers. But are you supplying recipes or information to your customers on how to freeze their own product they purchase from you, whether that's fruits or vegetables? How-to information can really help them be more satisfied with the products that they purchase from you, and then give them quick, easy meal preparations. Again, once they've frozen your green beans or your broccoli or your sweet corn or your strawberries or whatever that is, what do they want to do with that once it's out of the freezer? And so helping your customers with that kind of information can be really helpful and draw them back to you again and again.
You know, you're talking about freezers, but 50, 60 years ago, canning was an important part, especially in the rural area. Did she mention anything about canning? Or?
You know, it's interesting. She did not mention it in her article, but I have seen other articles, and just talking to people, canning increased dramatically. there for a while, it was very hard to secure jars, rings, lids,
Wow.
the actual container you need to can in. We also, through our Family and Consumer Sciences program with OSU Extension, they offer information and training on preserving and canning foods. Talking to some of them, they definitely saw an increase in people that were wanting to can. And so, again, a great resource for them. You don't have to create all that information as a producer, but if you can direct your customers on, again, if I buy quantities, am I going to buy a bushel of beans or am I going to buy a pound? That's a big difference. And helping your customers be successful when they purchase your locally produced food can really go a long way to adding and increasing their loyalty to you. But that's a great question, Patrick. And then finally, number 7 on the list was local is a bigger lure. Due to, again, according to the article in the New York Times, the fragility, hard word to say, of the supply chain. And I think we did, especially early on in the pandemic, see that not only with food, but a lot of things. And so that...
Well, I think one of the reasons that there is such a problem with the supply chain is the fact that a lot of people were staying at home. Mm-hmm. And many times in the food production, you do need hands-on.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Patrick.
And it wasn't the fact that someone was trying to keep or hoard the food as it was, they just couldn't process it.
That's really a great point. I know, again, early on in the pandemic, we had a situation where dairies were having to dump perfectly good milk. And it's not because the milk was bad or there was anything wrong with it. There was nowhere to go. If you stop and think about how much milk is sold or moved through school systems for lunches, and that all went away basically overnight. And so the supply chain just wasn't set up to handle all that extra milk. And so I was actually watching a national news channel, and they said that farmers were dumping milk because it was bad. Well, that's not the case at all. The milk was perfectly fine. The supply chain couldn't handle more milk. And so, again, the pandemic really highlighted some of those challenges that we have with the way our food system is set up. And it will be very interesting to see over the next 5 to 10 years what we've learned from the pandemic as far as our food system is concerned and how we make those adjustments.
Well, I think also, as everything seems to be starting to open up, the food supply chains have to now accommodate a much wider and a much broader base of need.
Yeah, I think that's true, Patrick. Again, the way customers are shopping for food has changed, so we have to be aware of those changes and how many of those changes will remain into the long term. Is there still going to be customers wanting to stock their freezers, for example? Are they still going to be those folks that order online for the bulk of their shopping? Again, because while that online ordering has dramatically increased, it does cut down on those impulse item buys. And
yes,
so,
it does.
As local food producers and then sellers of local food, do we need to focus on those basics? Or how are we going to get the attention of your customers, especially the ones that are still shopping online for your product or services?
So if we're buying more healthy food, it is interesting, prior to the pandemic, we as a nation really gorged on fattening foods. Did she mention anything about now that the pandemic is here, that we're eating more healthy?
There was a statement or two in here about produce, and of course that produce sales have continued to increase, and we all know fresh fruits and vegetables are healthy for us. And so again, as a local food producer, you're producing fresh fruits and vegetables, or proteins, of course, but when we're talking about fruits and vegetables, that's right up your alley. So again, to make sure you're positioning yourself to your customers, that is an option to buy those healthy foods and safe foods. The other thing with this local being in bigger demand is people really wanted to support their local community.
Yeah.
And so whether it was the restaurants, which we all know struggled mightily through the pandemic, individuals really became, I believe, more aware of how supporting local businesses, food producers, restaurants, others in their community plays into helping the entire community thrive. CSAs, or community supported agriculture programs, had a waiting list, which is, it's where you get a box every week from a local farm, to have waiting lists just because the demand increased so much. One that I'm really interested in to see how that holds moving forward.
Well, let's suppose that I'm a food producer and I'm just sort of confused as to which direction to go, or maybe I need more information. Where should I go? Who should I contact?
That's a great question, and I appreciate that, Patrick. Our direct food and agricultural marketing team has resources as well. There are a lot of online resources also that can be helpful. The agricultural marketing service, that link there at the bottom of this screen, is a great source of news and information on local and regional food. If you think about pricing, because we are hearing about inflation and prices going up around the country, here are some great sources to help you figure out what other markets are charging for their particular products, whether that be fruits and veggies or meat, eggs, and poultry. And of course, you can always contact me directly. I lead a team of people through OSU Extension, and we work specifically with direct marketing farmers and food producers here throughout Ohio. Be happy to get you the information that you need.
Hey, we're talking with Christie Welch. Christie Welch is the direct marketing specialist with the Ohio State University Extension Program. Christie, thank you. I always learn a lot from you when you
Thank
come
you,
on.
Patrick. It's been a pleasure to be here as always.